Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff and Joe, the scientist, explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn and...
I'm Joe.
Okay, I have a couple interesting stories for today.
Okay.
All right, the first one is a story about a kid named James Leninger. He lives in Louisiana. And when he was just 2.5 years old, he started talking about some really vivid dreams he was having. He had strong memories of being a man called Lieutenant James McCready Houston. He went on to say that he'd been a World War II fighter pilot from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, who had been killed in Iwo Jima more than 50 years before. Okay, that sounds like wild imagination, right?
Or some influence from... So, for instance, if somebody had said...
Right.
You know, if he saw it on TV, or if someone was talking to him about his vivid dreams, and they were injecting information that the kid reflected...
Yeah. At the age of 2... Even before he was saying he was Lieutenant James McCready Houston, he was talking about planes, which isn't that unusual for a little boy to talk about planes and be fascinated by them. But he knew stuff about planes that his parents didn't know. They didn't know anything about flying or the Air Force, none of it. But he knew all kinds of stuff. One time, his mom took him shopping, and there was a shop window with a plane in it, and she said, "Look, it has a bomb at the bottom." And he said, "That's not a bomb. That's a drop tank." Well, his mother had no idea what a drop tank was. He went on to tell both of his parents that he had flown a plane called a Corsair, which took off from a boat called the Natoma. When his parents served him up some meatloaf for lunch one day, which they'd never made before, or at least not for him, he said, "Meatloaf, I haven't had that since I was on the Natoma." His father decided to do some research and discovered that there had been a small escort carrier called the Natoma Bay, which had been in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Further research proved there had indeed been a pilot called James Houston. His plane had actually been hit by Japanese fire and was struck in the engine on March 3rd, 1945. When James was 6 years old, and that was in 2004, so this is all happening recently, fairly recently compared to 1945, his father took him to a reunion of veterans who had served on the Natoma. Okay, let's just imagine. So that was almost 50 years later, after they'd been on that. So they're presumably, old people.
Yeah.
So while he was there, James was able to recognize one of his old friends, and he stood in awe as he said, "They're so old."
That's interesting.
Yeah. That's one story.
Stuff like from a conventionalist perspective, if the kid ever, at any point, even was in the same room as a documentary playing, kids' minds are like sponges. You know, they absorb information crazily.
Yeah, I agree.
So if there ever was even someone talking on the street, if the kid heard it,
Okay, so for a 2-year-old kid to know the name of a plane... And the name of somebody who flew that plane?
So if he was initially talking about planes and they set him in front of anything related to planes.
Okay.
A book.
It gets better, Joe. It gets better.
This is the same story?
No, here's another story.
Okay, go ahead.
No, that's that story. There was a kid named Cameron Macaulay who lived in Glasgow, Scotland.
I think it's Glasgow.
Yeah. Ever since he started talking by around age 2, he'd been telling his family about his previous life on the island of Barra, which is off the west coast of Scotland.
What year was this?
I don't know, but it's in the year of airplanes, phones, everything. His family had never been to Barra because it was over 200 miles away, and it was on an island. So to get there, it took them an hour by plane. They could have taken a boat, but that would have taken even longer, so they took a plane. The kids started talking about a white house that overlooked the sea and a beach. He said his dad on the island was called Shane Robertson and had died by being knocked over by a car. When they asked him about it, the little kid said, he didn't look both ways. That was great.
That's funny.
So the parents decided to take the kid to Barra. When Cameron was told he was going, he couldn't stop jumping up and down. "I'm going home. I'm going home." Upon reaching the island, they were astonished to find that they had indeed landed on the beach. Cameron started to run around yelling, "I'm back." They discovered there had been a Robertson family on the other side of the island from where they were staying They didn't tell Cameron about it, but they got in the car and they drove that way. When they arrived, Cameron recognized where he was, jumped out of the car, and ran straight to the house. He ran from room to room and knew all the different crannies and little hidey holes, as well as a secret entrance to a part of the garden. While they weren't able to confirm that Shane Robertson had lived in the house, they did know that Shane Robertson had actually existed on Barra. Mm-hmm. They found some of his relatives. His relatives didn't remember him living in that house, but they showed them some old photos that included a dog and a car, which were exactly as Cameron had described his own dog and his father's car. So as he grew older, he began to lose the memories of Barra, and after his visit, he settled down, happy to know that his mother in this life believed in his story. One of the last things that Cameron mentioned was when he was talking to a friend. He said, "Don't worry about dying. You just come back again." Now, his mother had asked him, "How did you get to me?" And he said, "I fell through and went into your tummy." Okay, so here we have...
And how old was he at that point?
I don't know. So those two stories, we don't really have any more information. They're just kind of like, wow, those are some interesting stories. And you've already mentioned one thing. If a kid watches TV and he sees something...
So like in that case, there wouldn't be any... Those people wouldn't have been on TV. I mean, he might have seen something or heard someone talking about the island, but he wouldn't know the people's names. They're just regular people. So the most important thing I think about that was that the kid knew the guy's name and the dog and the car thing. Mm-hmm.
And all about the house.
So if they went to the house and the kid was like bouncing around as kids do, and they're filling in information, I have a really hard time thinking that they aren't injecting their... If the fact that they even brought the kid to the island means they have a particular idea what might be going on.
True.
Whether or not it's true or not. But if the kid just, without any other information, came up with the name, the dog thing, and the car thing, and he knew how the guy died and whatever, if that wasn't like somehow, someone told the kid, which I couldn't see how, then that would really be information from another source, So information coming from a non-conventional or non-normal source.
The reason why I chose these two stories to tell you, because the internet is full of stories of parents telling about their kids saying, "Before I came here..."
So out of curiosity, where usually they're like stories in English, but are they always like they're coming from another English speaking place?
No.
Okay.
I have more information.
That's really important. I would not expect, if there was reincarnation, for you to come back always as the same type of person,
Okay. Well, I found lots and lots of stories of people who said that their own children had told them things like this. But I chose those two because the thing that's not included, that what I repeated to you, is that psychiatrists and researchers went along with those people to document this process. And so we can be pretty certain that these two kids did not have that information beforehand, that there was confirmed that this was some anomaly. So the U.S.
Well, as usual, the fact that those stories might be surprising means we're missing information. We might not be missing normal information. We might be missing super normal information. The fact that it's surprising means we don't understand something about it. We are missing something.
Well, it might not be as surprising as you think, because there's been all kinds of research at universities.
So, for instance, here's the other side of it. If the kid, there's information attached that can persist after they die, or somehow there's a transference of that information, so I'm talking about their memory, to a new body. When you're a fetus, you can't really hold information. But presuming that information can persist, there's information traveling on that's not in their brain. It's going along in something else. Or it's later, like they gain the information after they're born.
Through some other means.
It might not be a pure reincarnation, but instead they're gaining the information like for instance, if they're clairvoyant or whatever the term is.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
And they look back and they just like briefly live someone's life. That's not reincarnation. So it's about information transference. But the surprising thing then would be that's how the world works, and that's possible, and it's not something that we've ever experienced for directly. We can, interact with it, we can play with it. We can't do that. So it's surprising because either the kids saw a newspaper or heard someone talking about whatever just even once, or they're sitting there and examining their memories and they have that in their memory inexplicably, or they have like a vision of that person's life. However it works, there's something happening that's not just like it would be surprising if the kid heard a conversation and remembered it to that detail. That'd be surprising.
Yeah, for a 2-year-old kid, yeah.
And that's the source of why these stories are surprising.
Well, in the next segment, I'm going to tell you about studies.
Okay. And I would honestly completely expect there to be it's interesting because the law of large numbers essentially says no matter how there are unlikely things. So like, for instance, there's a whole bunch of 1 in a million chance things out there. You're going to see some of them frequently, essentially. Mm-hmm. So like that. It would be more surprising if there weren't studies being done on inexplicable things.
In the U.S. National Library of Medicine, on their website, they include an abstract of a study. It says an unknown number of American children claim to remember previous lives. And so in this paper, they analyzed the data of only 79 children that had experienced this. They also compared the data with a much larger number, but they don't say in the abstract what that larger number is, of cases that were like this in India. Not very many American children in these cases make verifiable statements. And those who do nearly always speak about the lives of dead members of their own family. So in other words, they weren't like those 2 other stories I told you where, some kid said he flew a plane called the Corsair and the other kids remembered a dog and a car. That was verified. There aren't very many verifiable cases in America. And they almost always speak about dead members of their own family. So I can remember when I was the mommy and you were the baby to their parent or something like that. But in Indian cases, the children usually speak of the lives of dead people in another family and often in another community. So that is a big difference.
There's a cultural difference in what the kids...
And this is important because of some of the theories people have come up about why this is happening. So Indian
causal models for how the kids can have that information.
Right. Indian children.
Yeah. If there's a prosaic explanation, then I would absolutely 100% expect there to be cultural differences. If there's a fundamental physical rule or law or whatever allowing this to happen, it's invariant to everything. It might even be invariant to there's aliens on a different planet. You can be reincarnated into them, But if it's a prosaic explanation, it's entirely invariant to what you are experiencing in your actual life. So, if you change where you live, there's going to be a difference in how this happens.
How it's expressed.
Whereas if you become an alien, it's still going to keep going. It's nothing that will have changed. You can't change the fundamental rule by any means because it's going to happen. Panpsychists believe that everything is conscious. You can be reincarnated as a bug or a rock.
I've heard that before,
or an electron. So it would not change. Most of your memories would be as a rock. And it would not translate exactly to being a person.
So in those American kids, they said the cases weren't really verifiable, but the Indian children, their cases were verifiable. They could verify that those people actually existed.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. In some respects, however, such as the age of first speaking about the previous lives, the content of the statements they make, and related unusual behavior, the Indian and American subjects were the same. There was virtually no other difference. So they talked about the fact that maybe the American cases come from a fantasy, just a pretend, but a wish-fulfilling motive or obvious gain for the child was not discernible in most of them, nor do the cases resemble fantasies of imaginary playmates. Some American cases of this type occur in families already believing in reincarnation, but many others do not. In these families, the child's statements about a previous life are often puzzling and even alarming to their parents. The child is sometimes involved in conflict over the apparent memories with members of their own family. What you're saying about how it would be expressed differently in different cultures, that seems like a fundamental difference. That Indian kids it would be strangers and they could be verified, whereas American kids, it's not so verifiable. So I thought that was kind of odd.
Again, like, there shouldn't be any difference, unless it's like, oh, how the kids learn to interpret their memory.
Well, that's a good point, yeah.
There shouldn't be any difference. Like, if I could stress anything with questions like these, there's like a million different possible reasons, causal models, how these things could happen. Like, for instance, maybe it's God speaking to them. Like, telling them a story about a different person. That would explain a lot, but it would also require more. Or maybe there's tiny alien spacecraft going around and they fly into your ear and tell you stories, Same sort of thing. That would require less, marginally less. Or maybe it's the kid just hears something. Or maybe just puts it together. Or maybe they're just saying enough to like accidentally incite people, and it's like they're saying goo goo gaga, and they said, what was that, Uncle Tom?
I could see that. Yeah, except that the cases where they're verifiable. So a lot of their sources here stem from a University of Virginia study that was done, and I believe that at least one of the people who were conducting that study has died now. So there's only, I don't know who's taking care of this study at this point, but it appears to still be inactive, whatever you would call it, where they're still working on it. And they did the same thing. So they're taking kids' statements. They're trying to verify those statements. They said that some of the kids even have birthmarks and birth defects that correspond to the wounds and other marks on the dead person who they remember being. It says in numerous cases, postmortem reports have confirmed those correspondences, which they're meaning how they correspond to one another. Older children usually lose those memories at about age 7. I'm just kind of skipping over.
Yeah, isn't that's typical though? Like, 'cause those kids will lose their memories of early.
Yeah, it is really typical. So in Psychology Today, another, something that's
journal.
Psychology Today is a magazine that usually takes studies and they write articles about them, so they're easier to digest. So they interviewed Barbara Graham, who is the author of a book called What Jonah Knew. And my understanding is that this book is actually a novel, but it's based on research she did into this phenomenon. She said there are decades of research. They've been doing this for a long time. So the psychiatrist who has died at the University of Virginia is Ian Stevenson, and child psychiatrist Jim Tucker also worked with him, and so maybe he has taken over this study. They have more than 2,500 cases of spontaneous recall of a previous life that have been confirmed. That's just
a nitpick. They're saying a previous life
with spontaneous recall of a previous life.
Okay.
What did I say?
Did the researchers say that?
I don't know. This is in the interview with the lady who's the author.
Because
she said...
So things like this is what I mean. So let's say, this is the actual way it works, is as you're being born, you're like eternal life. So
You're saying this is actually true, what you're saying right now?
I'm saying assume this is actually how it is.
Okay.
You, across your whole life, as you're being born, you have knowledge of everything that's going to happen in your life, and another person's eternal life comes and tells their story, okay? So now you're born, and you then have this information, you are saying stuff, and people are surprised at what you say. You didn't live that person's life, right?
Right.
So how it works, this was not your life. This was not your past life. You have information about this.
So why is that a valid explanation when another explanation is that Yeah, they were reincarnated.
Okay, listen to what I'm saying. Could that, what I just said, be differentiated right now from that their soul, or whatever you want to call it, they continued from one to the other? Could that be differentiated through studies, through anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so they're equal in terms of possible explanations. But the one, they did not live that past life.
Right.
So they didn't have that past life. It wasn't a past life.
They're not saying it was a past life. They're saying that
the words they're using, so like that, if the researchers are saying that, it indicates a bias for a particular model.
It's an author who is repeating what she researched for her book.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the researcher said. But can I just finish? These are young kids who generally begin talking about a former life. The researcher...
They call it a former life.
The kids are saying, yes, that's what the kids are saying. That's what those other two kids said.
So the kids are saying it's a former life.
Before I was here, I was James McCready or whatever it was.
So they're saying it in the context of the kids saying that it's a former life.
Yes.
Every possible explanation is valid until they can be ruled out.
I absolutely agree with you.
Now, and what I'm saying right here is, if the researchers have a bias for a particular model, it's going to translate into a bias in their research. And bias in research could mean that they are using a statistical model that also has a bias. And so the numbers are wrong. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that's terrible, because if you already can't rule out any particular model, then you are now making it artificially more likely. You're giving more evidence than it should get to one particular model or family of models. So, like for instance, here's a model. When you die, you go into a vast room, and there's like an alien intelligence from a different universe, and they match you up with somebody else from your local area, and you exchange information. And for whatever reason, when you then are reincarnated, so you had a life, and then you talk to somebody else who had a life, when you're born again, there's like a fault in the mechanism, or they don't care to fix it. And when you're born, you have a 50-50 chance of remembering your real past life or the person you talk to's past life.
Okay, so if we're
what I mean?
If we're going to
That's unlikely, because it requires more, and it's more specific.
So if we're going to go along with the idea that reincarnation exists, until I read some of the stuff I read today, I honestly had pretty much, having gone through a period of time where I believed in reincarnation when I was a teenager or maybe a young adult, I pretty much had eliminated that from my...
I don't know what the fuck that was.
Freaking ghosts.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I think maybe someone outside, I don't know. Or it could be the house settling, the cracks
come on.
and stuff.
Come on.
It was Glenn.
Oh, stop it.
Okay, anyway.
Okay, so I early on in my life, I did believe in reincarnation, and then I pretty much decided I didn't believe in it. But after reading some of the stuff I read today, which I still have not told you, the piece de resistance about this.
Okay.
I think maybe I'm going to take it more seriously. And if I'm going to take reincarnation more seriously, what you just said is such a convoluted, complicated way to go about it.
Yep, usually people prefer simple models.
Yeah, and to explain why somebody remembers a previous life is because another dead person before they were reincarnated told them.
Now keep in mind, probably the very most simplest, besides the prosaic models, is the clairvoyance model. I mean,
yeah, and I think that's what I've always thought is, and I haven't ruled that out, is clairvoyance. But
it'd be very difficult to.
Well, let's think about that. So if it's clairvoyance, that means that person's essence is just floating around, and that kid...
Yeah, so, the information from that person. So it could be, like, for instance, there's, like, record keeper entities that are wandering around and recording people's lives. And then when a person dies, they go elsewhere, and then the record keeper is now wandering around, and they could tell the thing. Or
okay, but again, that is so much more complicated than saying.
But it can't be. It gives the exact same result.
It might, but okay. So if it is the memories of a person who has died, but it is not actually that the person was reincarnated. Couldn't you say that the memories of that person are now, radio waves, just waiting for someone to turn the dial on the radio?
If you can give me any model of the universe, how that would work.
Okay. The other way is the multiple universe theory that you talked about or have talked about.
Quantum.
So somehow that kid is able to experience or view or something, interact with.
Just like real quick, the real problem with the many worlds or quantum mechanical alternate universe is they're all time synchronized. So like you couldn't view something that was in the past unless the one caveat is, so if the person in the past is quantum immortal, then they would live for essentially
quantum immortal.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. It's very difficult to describe, and there's an even weirder version of it that allows anything to happen. But like, I just have to stress, science is about ruling out models. And why science? Because it's about how effective at convincing other people what you've written down is. So you did something in private, you wrote it down. How effective is that at convincing everyone else that they should rule out this family of models? That's essentially what science does. So you write it down to convince other people. They replicate it to convince other people. They look at what you wrote down and find fault with it to try to continue to convince people, get everyone on the same page, and if everyone believes it, then they rule out these models. Like if they could rule out the intelligent alien entities from another dimension model for continuance of soul, whatever, then that's great. That's science at work. But no one has done that, and I can't even imagine how you would rule it out. How, like, you could confidently rule out that there's like an alien squid being that's just like plucking people's souls out.
Well, nobody is saying that.
No one is saying that, and yet it is exactly equivalent to the other ones, in effect.
Okay, well, the University of Virginia is trying to do something verifiable. So one of the interesting things at the University of Virginia that they've discovered is that 70% of the kids with memories of a previous life, just for a second, entertain that these are memories of a previous life.
So wait, we're assuming that it's like classical reincarnation where there's like a soul or something? No,
we're just assuming that these kids have memories of a previous life, not a squid monster came down and injected them.
I mean, like, what exactly are we assuming?
We're assuming that the children are telling a researcher, I remember being this other person.
Okay.
And the researcher has verified that other person actually lived and died. Okay. So 70% of those kids can remember dying by murder, suicide, or an accident. And more than 35% of them show intense fear related to the way they died. They display the kind of avoidant behavior that is part of the official DSM criteria for PTSD.
Interesting.
So one of the things I read on just a discussion board is a woman pointed out that it makes sense that you would, if you had a traumatic death, you would remember the traumatic death and you'd be affected by it. So maybe that is not so unusual. And maybe if you had a very peaceful death, you just, why would it be of any importance at all, or it wouldn't be remembered in the same way? Okay, so I don't think that is as significant as they're making it out to be, because, it seems like, yeah, you'd remember the scary shit that happens to you.
If you could, for whatever reason, have memories of, like, being someone else, presumably, even at that age, you could presumably also have memories from any source of dying a particular way. And regardless, a memory or even a fictional or real memory of that would not be a good experience.
Right. Because if it's a memory, whether it's real or manufactured, it would affect you. Okay, so here's the cool thing. So, are you familiar with RNA?
You mean like genetic?
Ribonucleic acid?
Yeah.
Okay. So they've done some studies. I don't know if I wrote down where they did the studies, where they've been studying. It's actually worms they're studying. Some scientists studying the worms say that We discovered the synthesis of small RNAs in neurons as needed for the worm to efficiently be attracted to odors associated with essential nutrients, to look for food. The small RNAs produced in the parent's nervous system influenced this behavior, as well as the expression of many germline genes that persisted throughout at least 3 generations. So what the researchers in Virginia are looking at is RNA somehow influencing these children's memories, the experiences of their ancestors, and then they're putting words to them or in some way applying those memories as much as a 2-year-old can do.
So wait, how does the RNA...
So the RNA is affected and is changed through the experiences of your body. That's epigenetics is what it is. So it's changing the genetics of your body. And then when you have children, that is passed on to your children.
So the changes like memory.
Well, they're looking at the memory part of it because they knew that there were changes in your body that are passed on to your children. But now they're looking at these earthworms and discovering that it's actually memories and knowledge is passed on to the offspring of the worm for 3 generations.
Okay, so you encode, like I'm pretty sure this is settled, you encode memories all throughout your brain, essentially, your entire brain. It's very complex. There's a lot to it, and it's not just like spatially, but there are patterns that have to happen in sequence through time in your brain, and the memories are very specific to your brain. Like in order for me to directly move a memory from my brain to your brain, there's a whole translation process. A lot of information would be lost. A lot of information would have to be essentially generated for it to fit, faithfully into your brain. So it's like how does the ghost manipulate the printer thing? How does a complex, very complex memory get encoded in a way that then can be transferred to something that has a completely different encoding scheme for the memories?
I think an important thing to think about, though, is that if this is in its infancy, this research, maybe there are other things about our physical bodies that is somehow recording information.
So, for instance, if there's some process that actually takes information from your brain, like in sequence, like it's encoded, like your neurons are actually like spatially encoded, and then they get joined up with DNA strands or some polymer or something, and it builds a structure, and then that's moved down into a fetus, and then that goes in the fetus brain, and then it disassembles that and uses that to, totally, that could transfer real, like through standard physicalist means of information transfer. You have something,
but that's
put
a
it into
whole
a form,
area of
transfer
science that is not known.
Yeah, and if it's a rare enough phenomenon, it's dubious whether anybody would even see it happening.
Right.
You can't like stick a probe into into a human fetus's brain while they're developing.
Please, no.
Like every drop of blood, and then have them live. Would be not only illegal, but
this is really interesting, and I will have to look this up to confirm it. But they have done some kind of testing on fetuses' brains while they're in utero, and discovered that their mental activity is akin to a dream state.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting.
But, however, the other side of it is, if there is another structure, so this is physicalism again, there's rules to the universe. Like, if I move over here, there's other stuff, and the universe really exists, If there's another physical phenomena that's encoding information, then it's like a lot easier. It makes a lot more sense. It's much easier to transfer information. So like, for instance, the soul thing is actually really attractive here because it's attached. So it's like, for instance, imagine you have, I'm going to put quotes around astral body, okay? And as you live, it's mirroring your brain structure in its form. So like, it's exactly the same as your body, atom to atom. Everything is the same. And then when you die, it just splits off. So it's everything exactly the same. And it continues like functioning exactly the same. It's just now it's no longer interacting with, normal physical materials. And then that now has a complete exact recording of your memories, everything. And not only that, it can also it can communicate. It's exactly the same as your physical body.
In other words, it's a ghost.
Yeah, so now you imagine that drifting over and talking to a little kid in his dreams.
Okay, why is this so difficult for you to say, okay, that could happen?
It could.
But maybe it's reincarnation. Maybe it drifts over and goes into a fetus.
It could.
Okay.
There's nothing.
Well, I just want to point out that the RNA theory that these researchers are looking at does not explain the children who are primarily American children who have memories of being somebody who they're not related to. The Indian children, American children have memories of somebody that they are related to. The Indian children are not related to them.
That's interesting.
The Indian children, that doesn't explain that. Unless everybody in India is related within 3 generations. It doesn't explain that at all.
There's also, I think, a problem with information buildup with that. You would expect a significant loss of information as you go back, Like, there are people who say they were reincarnated from a long time ago. And there would be no mechanism, unless there would be like a molecule that just happens to be still drifting around from 2,000 years ago.
One of the problems with when people say, I was Cleopatra, there's really no way you can validate that.
Yeah.
Or they say I was some farmer living in a dirt hut.
Yeah.
And,
And also, that brings up another problem. If one person says they're Cleopatra, and at the same time another person says, okay, there's still none of these models still can say no, they weren't also both reincarnations. They could be. It's not like a model says, no, you can't, your soul can't just replicate itself.
Well, that's a creepy thought, yeah.
But there's nothing, this is what I've been saying. I mean, there's all these alternate models. You can't, the way you distinguish between them is by doing things and recording the result. So you can't distinguish between, if for instance there was a study that was measuring like a fetus's memories, and then it suddenly saw new information popping up, then they could rule out any model that had the fetus develop with the information because it suddenly developed it later. That would rule out models, except the ones that are really complicated. But you would have to be,
people are not going to submit their unborn child to that sort of thing because it's dangerous and weird and everything else. And that alone, just observing that, would change that kid's development.
Yeah.
So
you couldn't
don't want
confirm
to do that stuff.
Exactly.
But, okay, so tell me, what do you think it is that's making these kids have memories of verifiable previously alive people that are now dead? What is making them?
I have 3 stages of belief, which is feeling, believing, and knowing. I don't know it. I don't believe any one particular one. And the sense of feeling any one particular one over others, which doesn't really represent my beliefs. It's not like one is really high. I feel most about this one. It's just like generally some feel better than others. So I can't really say, it's not like I have one preferred idea of what's happening. I have generally a class that's vaguely more preferred than others.
So what's vaguely more preferred than others?
Unfortunately, they're not physicalist models. So they don't use a real, like a physical universe, And those are just feelings, so it's not like I even believe them. But like in order for this to be, like to satisfy this, it's like the associative universe. Information can transfer between similar, recognizable configurations of phenomena. So, like the kid's brain just happens, for whatever reason, to be, as the universe determines, associated or similar to the person in the past, and so there's information transfer, or it goes towards that. Or the simulation hypothesis, which, again, this is just my feelings on what are more likely. Simulation hypothesis. We haven't even talked about the fucking simulation hypothesis. Not even hypothesis, simulation model.
You can't go into it right now. We are almost done.
But yeah, the simulation model would explain a fucking lot of all of this. And you can literally never rule out the simulation model.
I can tell already that it's going to give me nightmares. This was a fascinating dive into how some kids have memories of previous lifetimes. At the end, Joe mentioned that there's a model in physics that could explain reincarnation. So in our next episode, he's going to tell us how that would work. Has your child ever told you about a memory of a previous life or family? We'd love to hear about it. Our contact information is in the show notes. And as always, if you have a story you want to tell, send it to us. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.